Hello everybody, today I am going to be talking about the ancient legendary city of Alexandria. And more specifically, I'm going to be talking about the mathematics that happened there and the knowledge of transfer as well as some of my own personal commentary. So without further ado, let's get started with a quick history lesson on the city. So as the name would suggest, Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great himself in northern Egypt. And Alexander wanted to create this empire of knowledge, as he called it. And he wanted to go about doing this by creating this giant library which would house all of human knowledge. And it seems crazy, but Alexander was a pretty ambitious man. Unfortunately for him, however, he kind of died before the library was finished being constructed. Under Ptolemy the First, however, the Library of Alexandria was finally done. And by the way, this is not what it actually looked like. We don't really know what the library itself looked like, but what we do know about it is that it housed a very large number of Greek and Egyptian scrolls. It had lecture halls and classrooms, and scholars were invited to live and study at the library. Now, under Ptolemy III, the library's contents increased significantly, and much of this is because of a new rule or policy instituted by Ptolemy III, which required every ship that docked at Alexandria shores to turn over all of their books for copying. So scribes would take these books from the ships, copy them, and then they would return not the originals, but the copies themselves. They would actually keep the originals and store them in the library. And I thought that was kind of funny. But anyway, there were other ways that books were gotten and taken to Alexandria. For example, there were hired book hunters who scoured all over the Mediterranean Sea in search of books. But books and texts were also gotten through trade and conquest. It's also kind of important to note that Alexander's empire was huge. I mean, it was enormous. Just look at it on the map. And that kind of implies that the library might have housed some Chinese, Indian, Persian, maybe even Babylonian texts. So as we can clearly see, the library was a center of knowledge, not just mathematical knowledge, but the city of Alexandria and the library allowed for a mix of ideas that kind of is the whole reason for our current understanding of math, if that makes sense. But anyway, I'm just going to talk about some of the prominent mathematicians who studied at Alexandria. And one other thing to note, it's pretty infamous that the library burned down. But even after the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the city itself continued to be a center of knowledge. And one of the most prominent people who actually taught and studied at the library was Euclid himself, not to be confused with Euler. But anyway, other than Euclid, there were other prominent mathematicians who studied at the library. And one example of this is Archimedes, who many of you might recognize from the law of the lever, because, well, he kind of, created or discovered the law of the lever. But yeah, he actually studied at Alexandria during his youth and invented the Archimedean screw there. Another mathematician who studied at Alexandria was Eratosthenes, if I said his name right. Hopefully I did. But anyway, Eratosthenes was actually a good friend of Archimedes, and studied mathematics, astronomy, and geography. He actually devised the first system of longitude and latitude that we use today, and surprisingly, he was able to calculate the circumference of the Earth up to a few miles of accuracy, which is pretty insane. And that's just honestly impressive. Another mathematician, prominent or not that prominent, I guess, that studied at Alexandria was Heron. And Heron actually grew up in Alexandria, and he is best known for his work with triangles. And he kind of experimented with similar triangles. He devised a formula for computing the area of a triangle from its side lengths alone. And apart from that, he also created an iterative algorithm for computing the square root of numbers. And surprisingly, he also created the world's first steam engine, which is really insane. But anyway, Menelaus was another Alexandrian mathematician, and he mainly dealt with the geometry of the sphere and its applications in astronomy. So, for example, in measurements and calculations. And apart from that, he also introduced the concept of spherical triangles. Apart from Menelaus, Diophantus was also I'm sorry, I kind of had like a little brain fart right there, but I am back now. So, back to the content. So, Diophantus, if I even said his name right, he is actually considered the first mathematician to recognize fractions as numbers. He also did extensive work in algebra and did a lot of work concerning I'm sorry, I butcher his name so many times. Diophantine equations, which are pretty much polynomial equations with more than one variable. One simple example can be seen here. But let me just get rid of that. And apart from Diophantine, another prominent mathematician was Ptolemy. Not the ruler or rulers, since there were multiple, but the mathematician. And some of his contributions include a table of trigonometric chords for a circle. He solved plane and spherical triangles, which were mentioned earlier. And he actually created many maps of Europe, and they were pretty accurate too. Just one example can be seen right here. Wait, I messed that up. Right here. And these maps were actually used up to the Renaissance, which means they were actually very accurate. And lastly, the last mathematician I'd like to talk about is personally one of my favorites. Her name was Hypatia, and her father, Theon, he was a mathematician and astronomer, and he actually educated her himself from a young age. And eventually, Hypatia became the city's foremost scholar. She even took over the position of her father as the head of the Platonic school, which was the equivalent of a huge university at the time. Anyway, Hypatia wrote a lot of textbooks. She refined scientific instruments and developed a more efficient way of doing long division. In addition to that, she also developed the philosophy of Neoplatonism, which is pretty much the belief that numbers were the sacred language of the universe. Unfortunately, she was murdered in 415 by a group of Christian monks, and with her, or after her death, Alexandria's role as a center for learning declined, and eventually it pretty much disappeared. But anyway, personally, I think that the story of Alexandria kind of gives us a valuable lesson, and it illustrates that all of our current mathematical understanding is a result of the collaboration and combination of many different mathematicians' ideas from throughout the world. And I'd like to share one of my favorite quotes, and it is, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," by Isaac Newton. And to me, this quote, I really like it because, it kind of acknowledges those people who came before us and, you know, worked hard and contributed something to not just mathematics, but the world in general. And I think it's important to, give credit where credit is due and, acknowledge those people that came before us and did all the hard work, laid the foundation for our current understanding of math, because many times their contributions are not acknowledged, and I feel like it is very important to do so. Anyway, that is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and might have some new content, might not, I don't know. But anyway, have a great night, everyone, or morning, or afternoon.